Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Muslim Street. I am super excited. I'm kind of fangirling over here, but I have a special guest with me tonight. It is Dr. Adnan Husain. He is actually one of my favorite professors, one of the reasons I actually got started with the Muslim Street. I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience, and we'll get right into it.
Oh, well, thank you for your kind words. That's very flattering and gratifying. I'm a professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and my main area of interest is Muslim, Christian, Jewish interactions, multicultural and religious societies of the pre-modern world, but also the kind of conflicts and the birth and origins, you might say, of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, and its relationship to other forms of religious bigotry and racism like anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, settler colonial white supremacist violence, and so forth. So I studied the Crusades and all of that. But listeners to this show may be most interested in what I do as a podcaster as well. I'm a co-host of Guerrilla History, which is a kind of radical, history project that tries to use the resources of history for contemporary, social struggles and movements for liberation. So we see history as a resource and a guide that we can learn from, and try to employ in our analysis of the contemporary world as we try to improve it.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. So tonight's topic, we wanted to discuss the Swana region, especially geopolitics currently going on. With what happened yesterday, I mean, we all eventually saw it coming. I did kind of want to take a focus on both Palestine and Syria. I've noticed with Syria, the entire Muslim world is completely divided. Not even just the Muslim world. I mean, people just in general. You have, people neoliberals, you have the leftists, you have the conservatives, you have the global population kind of wondering what the right side is, which way to lean. I personally think that with Syria, it's definitely going to affect Palestine. And there are many dark days ahead with everything going on. But I also wanted to, kind of delve into that and get your analysis, because it just seems like there's a lot of conflicting news sources. There's a lot of different ideologies going on. So I would really love to hone in on that.
Yes, well, this is such an important and, as you pointed out, Hina, divisive topic. And of course, events have just been spiraling very quickly. It's hard to keep up. And of course, part of the strategy, is always the media war and disinformation. And it's clear that a certain kind of psychological warfare of trying to terrorize the opposition, was employed successfully in contributing to the speed with which some of these groups, HTS, as they've been rebranded, and other kinds of non-state, militias and groups in the opposition, the so-called rebels, moderate rebels, some have called them, employed that successfully. So it was very hard to keep up with exactly what was happening. And as you said, there are so many conflicting news sources and different agendas and angles. And this is one issue that has divided for the last decade and more media and actors and governments and constituencies across the MENA region, Swana region, West Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Islamic world as a whole. So I think, we do have to be careful and conscious that we don't know everything about the, groups and the motives and who was supporting whom exactly, what the goals are, or even more, I think, importantly, going forward, how this is going to work out. What the future of Syria, will be. But what we do know is that the Assad government has fallen, and then we also do know that of course, despite many criticisms what one might have about its role historically in the in Palestinian liberation, it has at the very least never normalized relations with the state of Israel. It maintained, despite other neighboring countries signing peace agreements and essentially, abandoning the cause of Palestine to pursue their own economic and geopolitical interests. So countries like, of course, starting with Egypt, which was the most important and decisive one under Sadat after 73 and the weakening of the Arab alliance, you had a separate peace being negotiated to receive back the Sinai Peninsula, which had been occupied by Egypt under the Camp David Accords, and from then there has been persistent pressure placed, particularly by the United States, over its allies in the region to normalize relations with Israel. And the Oslo so-called peace process that began in the early 90s, was the venue in which, if the Palestinian Liberation Organization itself was willing to enter into negotiations for over a long period of time, it kept getting delayed and deferred despite the creation of the Palestinian Authority. It created the context and the opportunity for pressure on other regimes to sign peace agreements and to normalize. And so Syria has been alone in the neighboring countries of the Arab, region, a country that, still has territory that is occupied illegally by Israel after the 1967 war, the Golan Heights, and which it has annexed and been I believe, this is under the last president and now upcoming president, Donald Trump, was, kind of recognized and legal. Well, it can't be legalized because it's illegal under international law, but sort of accepted and recognized by the United States. And so Syria had a kind of special position in the Arab resistance, but it also was a long-term ally of Iran, and thus, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the late martyred leader of Hezbollah, called it the backbone of the axis of resistance, because it's what kind of connected Iran and southern Lebanon and other kind of groups and forces who continued to resist the Zionist entity and U.S. empire in the region. So the loss of Syria, of course, is going to have consequences for the Palestinian cause. And this is something that has puzzled me, regardless of one's position on the Assad government and historic human rights violations, crimes, political suppression, and so on. Are a pro-Palestine person and believe that the cause of Palestine is right now the most important issue. And if you have a more global and anti-imperialist analysis that is able to see that resistance to Israel is fundamentally broader than just the disposition of the, kind of Zionist settler colonial state there, but that it is actually the keystone and the linchpin of U.S. imperial hegemonic plans for how to kind of dominate the region and divide the region and disrupt its, sovereignty and national and regional development, in sovereign ways, but to actually subordinate those to U.S. empire, then you see that the stakes of Syria are much higher than, geopolitically speaking, and that's what we're here to talk about, is geopolitics in the Muslim world, is geopolitically, very, very crucial to the Palestinian cause and to the larger conditions of U.S. empire in the region. And so I was sort of bemused in the, past week and a half by how there was such a revival in just the same way that these groups that had been kind of quarantined but kept and supported and nurtured in Idlib province, and then suddenly burst out and kind of revived the kind of regime change operation against the Assad regime, the Syrian government. How quickly and easily people who had been demonstrating, tweeting, writing, talking about how horrible the genocide in Gaza was, stopped talking so much about that and were incapable of making the connections that seemed to me at this point really quite obvious, and that this was serving Israeli and U.S. interests in the region, and that it would be incredibly detrimental to the Palestinian liberation struggle at this moment, suffering under genocide, to not be conscious that as much as we may be in solidarity with the people of Syria who have suffered horribly as a result, both of their government's repression, but especially because of externally funded, supported, and trained Takfiri jihadist movements being unleashed upon their society, that created so much chaos, havoc, brutality, to not, recognize that this was not necessarily the opportune moment to unleash these forces. I've been quite surprised and stunned, by the discourse, which is not to say that, I'm somebody who's spent actually quite a bit of time decades ago now. When I was studying Arabic and doing research as a graduate student, I lived for 6 to 8 months in Syria in 2 different time periods. I lived in the old city, in the Aymariya, the neighborhood behind the Umayyad Mosque, which is actually mostly a Shia neighborhood, and where there are important shrines like Sayyidina Ruqayya, a really important member of the family of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Syria, of course, it was like all of the other governments throughout the Middle East. We don't see one where you don't have freedom of speech and political rights in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or any of these countries. And it was like that. It was similar, but somehow people focus, because it's opposed to U.S. policies in the region and has maintained a principled stand, even if one could critique, its contributions to the Palestinian liberation movement. They've maintained at least a principled stand of no normalization until there is a negotiated broad settlement for all occupied lands to be returned. So my sense of it was that, yes, of course, it was a politically dictatorial, authoritarian regime, but there were Muslims of all sectarian, all different sects, Shia, Sunni, living rather harmoniously, Christians of many different kinds of Christian groups, Druze, Alavis, you had Kurds, you had Arabs, and of course, none of this was like some paradisal, utopia, but there was a kind of possibility for varieties of Muslim faith practice, of Christians, etc., coexisting in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society that really was torn apart by the so-called civil war. And I just feel that it's incredibly tragic, and that some of these, longer historical perspectives of Syria, as well as the moment in which this has been happening now, have been lost in some of the discussions about it, and about the possible consequences of it, which we at this point can only guess about. I'm a historian, not a political scientist, and political scientists like to predict what's going to happen, and I think it's a pretty bankrupt pseudoscience to be in the game of predictions, especially now when there's so little genuine information that we can use to analyze. But we can see the clear consequence is that Hezbollah, which has mounted the most significant resistance in solidarity. There have been others, of course, Iraqi groups, the Yemeni Ansarullah, etc. But Hezbollah has faced the full brunt of an attempted Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, held their ground, pushed them back, and kept them at essentially the border, despite the fact that, of course, they've had to endure horrific bombings of civilian areas and so on. They have suffered a great deal. And in this so-called ceasefire moment that was the immediate prelude and clearly part of some sort of negotiated plan of collaboration with other regional powers, particularly Turkey, to begin this kind of invasion, essentially from Idlib province, and an attack on the Syrian regime, that it's been, an attempt essentially to isolate Hezbollah, prevent them from being able to be resupplied, so that once this so-called ceasefire is over, despite the fact that, of course, it's been violated constantly well over 100 times by Israeli bombardment. I mean, even just a couple of days ago, 4 or 5 people, civilians, were killed in a civilian area. But that once Israel is ready to begin another assault, like full assault on southern Lebanon, that they expect Hezbollah to have been weakened by the fact that it hasn't been able to be resupplied, because the chain in the link of the axis of resistance, the link in the chain, rather, I should say, that had connected them to the only major nation state with any capability of supporting them in that is Iran, of course, has been broken. And so that's going to spell disaster, possibly in southern Lebanon, and it exposes the people of Gaza to standing more or less alone during this period, and facing, the full attempt at genocidal liquidation of North Gaza, at the very least. So that's how I see the current situation, basically, of Palestine and the connection between what's happened in Syria and Palestinian liberation.
But you brought up a really, really good point. I think when you are Muslim, you are studying like geopolitics in that region, and you also come from very anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, like Marxist background, you like avoid, I guess you can say, like US imperialist views altogether, because you realize that anything that's being reported is first and foremost going to be state-sponsored media, and it's going to be something that is not going to benefit or even be truthful, right? Because if the media was truthful in any capacity, we would not have half the proxy wars or the sanctions that we see in, not just this part of the world, but any part of the world, really. But that being said, I have noticed the exact same thing on social media. You are coming across a lot of accounts that are very like, hey, I'm pro, axis of resistance. I'm pro, Gaza. I'm pro Palestine, free Palestine. They're advocating for it 24/7. But then now when it comes to this whole issue with Syria, yes, I understand if you are, anti-Assad, but to say that the regime falling at the hands that it did with the rebels per se, it is now benefiting the US and Israel. And anytime there's been any sort of intervention from the US, especially in the Middle Eastern world, historically speaking, we've never seen it benefit anyone, of course, but the US itself. And, one of my theories is that when it comes to Israel, they kept talking about having like a greater Israel expansion. I personally think this is a byproduct of that. They were kind of hinting at, I don't even want to say hinting at it. They were discussing it left and right. And so the moment this happened, I was like, great, like this is now for the taking for Israel per se, right? It kind of opened the door wide open. And then on top of that, is there even going to be a Hezbollah going forward? Like that's a huge question as well. How will it kind of survive what's going on? And like you said, it's a huge backbone of the axis of resistance.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think, of course, Hezbollah will persist. They are not going to disappear under these circumstances, but they have been dealt a major strategic blow, and they have, of course, been weakened by having to face the full assault of bombardment. They've of course acquitted themselves remarkably on the ground when they have the opportunity to face Israeli troops, face to face, in battle. They've held their own, and they've done well, and they've inflicted quite a lot of damage. They've suffered damage, but they've inflicted quite a lot of damage, it appears, to the extent that, when Netanyahu had to rationalize and explain the ceasefire to a hostile Israeli public, from both the left and the right, because the extreme religious nationalists, messianic religious nationalists who are part of his government and can veto his regime and bring the government down if they left the coalition, believe that there should just be continuous war and that they want to settle southern Lebanon, up to the Litani River. They believe it is part of exactly that concept that you referred to of Greater Israel, which is envisioning a much larger, expansive territorial Zionist control over basically the region from the Nile to the Euphrates, from the Nil al Furat. This is kind of what they imagine is their biblical kind of inheritance. And that's the kind of, Israel is a country that has declared no actual borders, right? So they, it's unclear exactly where they see the end of Israel and the beginning of their neighbors. And, the concepts that they have are rather capacious and extensive for the territorial expanse of Israel. So this is one kind of point, is that they had this push. On the other hand, there's all the kind of liberal Zionists who are critical of aspects of the government and its prosecution of the war, and the fact that the hostages haven't been returned, and in fact actually haven't been rescued. And it seems that isn't actually even a major concern of the government, and that there's mounting kind of concerns about that. The people in the north, for example, mayors in the north, decried the ceasefire from their perspective because they didn't feel the situation was secure enough to go back to their homes and resettle the Galilee, because not enough, had been accomplished in terms of the military and political goals of Israel's, attempted invasion into southern Lebanon. So, in that context, Netanyahu had to kind of sell the ceasefire that he had made, and he himself mentioned that the Israeli army needed to be, needed to resupply. And it's clear that they were reaching their limits of capability. I mean, their army has been built on, kind of spectacular shock and awe kinds of styles of quick wars, and not this kind of long-term war of attrition. And so they've had difficulty, reserve units actually, not having full complements of soldiers returning from their, time off back to their rotation to go in. So, it was necessary for Israel, from its own, military, logistical and perspective, to have this sort of ceasefire. So, what that means is that, that Hezbollah really had fought a very serious, battle quite effectively. However, what they can't stop are, all of the bombardments of civilian areas. And that's what we've learned in Gaza, we've learned in southern Lebanon, is that Israel is maybe not so capable as a fighting force, but that its technology and air power allows it to kill an awful lot of civilians. That's what it's capable of doing. And that is a high cost, of course, for any of the neighboring countries. It's a huge cost for the Palestinians, for the, Lebanese, and so on. And so they've had to take this time to try and rebuild. They've suffered huge, massive losses in leadership, and there's some needed reorganization. The loss of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, I think, was very important. They will survive, but they are obviously in under huge pressure, and having to reorganize. And the fact that they're not going to be easily resupplied through the normal kinds of routes, those already had been somewhat disrupted, perhaps because Israel had bombarded all of the border crossings between, Syria and Lebanon and so forth. But, the loss of the Assad regime is obviously going to play a major role, unless, of course, whatever the new governing authority and new government in Syria would take as its position. Unfortunately, the groups that were responsible, have not indicated that they plan to maintain the Syrian government's historic strategy and principle stand of no normalization. Quite the opposite. In fact, we've heard many very positive remarks made about Israel by leadership of HTS, that they love Israel, that they plan to that they have no problem with Israel. I mean, for all the people who are pro-Palestinian, who are celebrating the end of the Assad regime. I mean, fine, you can celebrate the end of the Assad regime, but can you be positive about the consequences for Palestine of whatever future government is coming into place under the aegis of these sorts of groups that have never indicated that they have any interest in confronting Israel? I mean, I tweeted, very early on about if these groups are so kind of committed to the cause of, the Muslim Ummah and protecting it and all of that, why don't they go and open up a support front, in the Golan Heights? And in fact, now they have a border, essentially. They're controlling Quneitra, a city, the kind of southern city that was destroyed essentially in the 67 war and under Israeli, occupation fire during that 73 war. Quneitra was pretty much destroyed. And I visited the ruins of that city again, like 20 some odd years ago. And it's a very strategic location, the Golan Heights, because from there you actually can look right down into Israel, and on a clear day, people say you can see all the way, to Jerusalem and so on. At any point, it is a strategic location that Israel has been occupying. Now, these groups that are, oppositional groups are now controlling those border areas, and in Quneitra, they could, of course, direct their resistance to freeing Syrian territory. In the statement made by this new provisional group of the rebels, they made a statement, I think yesterday or earlier today, talking about how they were dedicated and committed to an inclusive Syria and the territorial integrity of Syria. So what do they plan to do about the fact that there is Syrian territory under Israeli occupation? I mean, that's, to me, the big question. So for all the people who are pro-Palestinian, that's the question they should be asking, is what's going to be the future Syrian policy toward Israel? And I'm afraid that, it doesn't look
very
like...
bleak.
Yeah, it's very bleak. It doesn't look like they're, that they have any problem, with Israel. They will probably normalize, and that's why it looks bleak for the Palestinians.
Yeah, and I think that's just so deeply unfortunate, because I think when it comes to pro-Palestinian discourse, a lot of people are like, oh, well, we should go back to the 1967 borders. And then some people are like, no, we need a fully free Palestine. Israel needs to cease to exist. I think with Syria coming into play, it's not even about either of those discussions anymore. Now we're like, is Israel going to expand further than the borders that were given, not just with 1967, but how they've been expanding at the moment? I think the discourse prior was also like, hey, this is what's going on in Gaza. Could it now potentially occur to the West Bank as well? Now it's, not even within that region. So I think, it's nice to be pessimistic, it's nice to be optimistic
Right.
and think that good things will happen as a byproduct of this regime change. But you also have to look at who is behind the regime change. And I think that's what a lot of people are failing to look at. If you are anti-Assad, hey, that's perfectly fine. I think everyone has their own opinion on the history of
Mhm,
this region. But
mhm.
then you always have to look at, who is behind, this regime falling, why is it occurring, and who benefits from it. And in
Yes.
this case, it is not the Syrians, it is not the Palestinians, it is not, not even the Muslim world, but like the region surrounding Syria at all. So I think this is going to have very devastating consequences. Like you said, we can all try to predict. My predictions, not as a political scientist, but just someone who keeps up with, current events. It seems very bleak, but who honestly knows? To me, it just reminds me a lot of when, like Libya, for example,
Yes.
when there was this division between Gaddafi, and there were so many people celebrating, when Gaddafi was killed. They thought it would be like this brand new revival, X, Y, and Z. And then, now you look at Libya, and unfortunately, I believe there's like an active like sex trade, and like it's
Mhm,
just
mhm.
gotten so behind. And then on the same token, you look at Iraq. I remember when Saddam Hussein had fallen, so many people were celebrating that. And now we look at the state of Iraq, and it's just it's regressed so much. So I think that's something to definitely watch for. And I think it's very important that when people are looking at the news, it's important to have your own opinions, but make sure you're looking at the sources and also look at motives, right? Like reading statistics, reading history, understanding what the news is telling us is one thing, but always understand the motives behind why something is happening. So that is definitely, something super important. I also wanted to hone in on Lebanon, actually. Now, with everything going on, I think the resistance of Lebanon is definitely going to be impacted as a byproduct of what happened in Syria. So, do you have any take on, the current state of Lebanon, why, or not why, but how actually it's going to move forward? Because it is still, very in the resistance. It's still trying to do what it can to protect Palestine in itself. And I know they've been bombing, southern Lebanon relentlessly. And like you said,
Mhm,
it's been
mhm.
predominantly civilians.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, even if you think about the situation of the ceasefire, and especially what Hezbollah ended up having to agree on, which may in the end not necessarily be strategically important, but certainly seemed to me to be a major principle um, of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah's policy that he announced. And in fact, actually, I believe it seems clear that he was assassinated partly because attempts at negotiating early on for some implementation of the UN Resolution 1701 and various other things that were on the table being discussed before his assassination. He insisted that there couldn't be a ceasefire and resolution of the increasingly escalating kind of conflict on either side of the Lebanese-Israel border, unless there was a resolution of Gaza, and that the two were linked, that there had to be a ceasefire for both. And of course, that was one of the things that was announced when the ceasefire was announced after 2 months, 8 weeks or so of unremitting kind of pressure, bombardment, and destruction in Lebanon, from southern parts of Beirut all the way down to border towns that had to, people were depopulated by people having to flee bombarding of their homes and hospitals and healthcare facilities and schools and so on, just like we've witnessed for 14 months or more in Gaza. That was a surprising development, and I think it only is possible. The way I read it is, of course, they were under extreme pressure, and it's a new, different leadership. But it seemed to me this was only something that might have been possible because there was internal Lebanese pressures that politically had to be managed. A very tense and difficult situation where Hezbollah's in government, but they're one faction, one party within Lebanon. There are, lots of different groups and interests and alignments. And despite generally sympathy towards Palestinians, there are forces that have been historically hostile to the cause of Palestine, racist and bigoted and sectarian against the Shi'i population of southern Lebanon, and of course, a long history of civil war within Lebanon, where groups were sponsored, much like what we saw happened to Syria for a decade, had happened in Lebanon for, a decade and a half, almost 20 years. That included also Israeli occupation of parts of southern Lebanon. And so it's a very fragile political situation. They've been under incredible economic pressures. You remember, I'm sure, the port bombing.
Yeah, and the
place.
government had stepped down after that. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
there was something nefarious going on there. I mean, Lebanese politics is one of great complexities, and it's not always clear what the forces operating behind, but there's obviously been a U.S. Sponsored interest in appointing, the head of the Lebanese armed forces. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. As president, like they wanted to be able to choose who should be, because Lebanon currently doesn't actually have a president, and that's because there's this confessional system where the president is typically from the Maronite community, and there's the prime minister is from the Sunni community, and the speaker of parliament, who's Nabih Berri, is from the Shia community. And, they've got this kind of constitutional almost arrangement that's based on the sectarian and confessional identities of the population. A totally outmoded colonial construct that was created by the French because they had wanted initially to establish a Christian majority enclave in, the Middle East. In some ways, it's meant to have been a very parallel sort of state to the Zionist entity. Of course, not with settler colonial displaced populations, but as a minority kind of religious, minority Western oriented kind of enclave to divide the Middle East, right? So, and divide the Levant. But that's not always been a very successful policy, but it led to tensions that, broke out into the Civil War. And of course, if you recall and remember the horrible massacre of Palestinians in the camps of Sabra and Shatila, during the period of Israel's invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon, the actual perpetrators of the killing were phalangist militias, who are these far-right, extremist Christian militias. And those forces didn't just disappear because there was the end of the Civil War. They're still there, and they're very hostile to Hezbollah as a resistance movement. And so it just seemed to me that there must have been real political pressure and difficulties, and Hezbollah wanting to avoid a possible reigniting of sectarian violent conflict that had led to the Civil War. And, with the loss of somebody like Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, who was a charismatic leader, who was, popular and had a kind of authority and respect from all factions, even if, they're hostile and opposed. I mean, you had to respect Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, and he was a very diplomatic and calm, sober, but somebody who could, I think,
He commanded a lot of respect.
That's right. I mean, and I think that was important in being able to negotiate some of the complexities of these differences and pressures while they were conducting a resistance movement. And with his loss, I don't know, was there the same kind of diplomatic and political nous and figures? These are figures who are new. They're come up from, from Hezbollah, but they're, these are a new leadership. Almost the whole leadership had to be, replaced. And so they don't have a track record of managing, perhaps at this level, the politics of this very dicey Lebanese political environment. So it just seems to me that they were feeling pressed. And the very same analysis that I would have about how they ended up having to agree to the ceasefire in certain kinds of terms suggests to me that, especially now with the collapse of the Syrian government and the kinds of forces that have been involved, these jihadi takfiri groups, they have their constituencies, allies, analogs, and so forth in Lebanon as well. And my concern and worry would be the spilling over of the conflict. Now that they've managed to depose the government and replace it, is to look to possible involvement. Not directly. I don't think any of these groups, could. They've faced Hezbollah in the last decade, since in 2015, when Hezbollah entered into, at the invitation of the Assad regime, when there were foreign fighters coming in. And it's clear that it wasn't just the arming of extremist Syrian groups, but kind of catalyzing and recruiting of a jihadist international, like from all over, from Chechnya, from Turkestan, from Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and other Central Asian and Caucasus Mountains, and volunteers from other parts of the Arab world. When those flooded into Syria, that's when Hezbollah and Iranian forces got involved in Syria, and they were pretty successful in combating and fighting these groups. So I can't imagine that these groups, HTS and whatnot, that have managed, because the Syrian army was in no condition to put up resistance and had a kind of moral collapse, after a decade and a half of constant and continuous horrible war, up until just, what was it, 2018 or 19, when there were the Astana process, and they came up with some accords that they would be quarantined in Idlib. It's only been a few years where there's been, and of course, Syria has continued to be under the worst sanctions probably in the world have been imposed upon Syria, the Caesar sanctions. So, they've been depleted.
Even stronger than the ones on Iran? I didn't know that,
Well,
actually.
I mean, I think I haven't done a forensic study of quite how
Right.
bad they are, but of course, the condition of Syrian society was even weaker and more desperately needing an influx of reconstruction aid and so on, such that the strict sanctions on it have proved even more devastating than the Iranian ones, because Iran is still, a functioning state. It has not been subject to unremitting, war by, and all these sorts of groups. Of course, there is MEK, Mujahideen Khalq, and so on, but that's pretty minor compared to what Syrian society underwent in the internecine, war for a decade, basically. So they've been able, it's very extreme in Iran, but they've been able to weather it. I mean, more than weather it, they've been providing support for Syria and for
Right.
Hezbollah, despite the fact that they've been under sanctions, right? So my
Right.
point here is that, I don't think that these groups are in any condition. They managed to overpower a demoralized Syrian army that had lost kind of, any perhaps belief in the government and the cause of the government. I don't think they're going to directly engage and attack Hezbollah. I mean, those are a very serious, disciplined fighting force that they've already been unsuccessful in previous theaters in Syria. But I do think their alliances with certain extreme conservative groups in Lebanon, could be a threat, I think. So it's a very dicey situation, it seems to me, going forward in Lebanon. I'm not a Lebanon, expert, and there's so many, particularities to the Lebanese situation, but globally overall, I can see outlines of how what's happened in Syria could have spillover consequences. It already must have them, simply because it'll be harder for Hezbollah to resupply and rearm and so on. But there could also be an intensifying of the political pressure that I think led to the ceasefire on Hezbollah in the next period going forward.
Yeah. And I mean, I hope one thing that this region in general realizes is anytime there's any sort of ceasefire agreement, it's theoretical, it's
Oh yeah,
performative, and it's only one-sided. So that
yeah.
is something to take into consideration as well. Really quick, I just wanted to thank the Lance Gerb Show for, doing the technology and helping us put this together. You are listening to The Muslim Street. We have a weekly podcast on Sunday nights. Right now, we have our special guest, Adnan Husain, one of my favorite professors. And, if you'd like to contribute to the periodical, we have www.themuslimstreet.com. Please feel free to message us. We'd love for you guys to collaborate with us. And thank you for joining us tonight. So, Mr. Hussein, I did have a quick question for you. In terms of, this entire region and what's going on, let's focus on, Palestine as a whole, because that is still, despite everything that's going on, the biggest issue. And it's been, I think, the biggest issue for the last 75 years, if we are being candid. When it comes to what's going on in Palestine, of course, it's going to be heavily influenced by, as a byproduct of what just happened in Syria. But Palestine as like an independent entity and the position that it's in right now with Israel, can you explain to our audience how we kind of got here? Because I know for a lot of people, they hear the West Bank, they hear the terms, Gaza and Northern Gaza and what's going on. They hear about like the 1967 borders. I'd love to hear like kind of for like the last 10, 15 years, how we went from, the elections that were, when was it? Like, was it 2008, 2009 to where we are right now? I'd love to hear like kind of,
Well, I
your
think,
analysis of that.
I think they were the 2005
Oh, there we go. Okay.
elections that led to Gaza being completely sequestered and under siege. Where Hamas actually won the elections overall in both the West Bank and Gaza, but were prevented, of course, from taking government under the Palestinian Authority, if in fact that's how they wanted to translate their electoral victory. And there is reason to think that in many ways that movement has always framed itself as a resistance movement, and it might have been some kind of a contradiction to actually take government as a franchise subcontractor of the occupation, which is what the Palestinian Authority essentially does and has accomplished since the Oslo Accords were first established. Already by the late 1990s, it was clear that the Palestinian Authority was merely, a perpetuator of Israeli occupation, but putting a Palestinian face on it and creating, an intermediate comprador sort of class that could manage the occupation and some of the, brutal suppression of Palestinians on behalf of Israel, but that it didn't have any genuine sovereign authority, and that the pathway towards an actual Palestinian state would always be derailed. This is what was already becoming clear by the late 90s. And it led to, other resistance movements, chief among them Hamas, but there were, other ones starting to continue resistance against the occupation, but also attempt to try and displace the Fatah in the Palestinian Authority. And so they contested elections, and actually, much to the surprise of many external observers, did quite well in them. But that led to complete siege on Gaza, where they were able to basically wield whatever power or authority one can under the occupation, but as a resistance force. And so, for it was a very harsh siege that had gone on until from basically 2005 until the present day, and only intensified after October 7th, 2023. So it'd been, a decade and a half of complete suppression. But I think one thing that was important is to recognize that resistance always continued, and this is why there was essentially a war in 2006, and it was one that repeated a little bit the pattern we saw after October 23rd, October 7, 2023, which was that there was attack on Gaza, and it led Hezbollah to actually, in solidarity, confront Israel in the north, and it led to a kind of brief war where Israel attempted to reoccupy the south of Lebanon. They expected to be able to recapture areas that they had lost in 2000 when the resistance in southern Lebanon managed to end Israeli occupation after 18 years of fighting against it. But they were soundly defeated, and that was really something of a scar. There was a bit of a complex, I think, afterwards. I mean, it was unheard of for an Arab, in this case, a sub-state actor, not even a state, but the militias of a resistance movement to be able to defeat Israel. So there have been, since then, quite a number of attacks on Gaza. 2008. And we're talking about, more than 1,000 people would be killed in these bombardments of civilian areas. I believe, there was a major attack in 2012, 2014, 2019, 2022. And so it's just been an unceasing, well, actually, what's interesting is that during this period of so-called mowing the lawn, which is Israel's term for its occasional colonial violence on Gaza, is that they thought that they had basically handled the situation and contained the Islamic resistance movements, or all the resistance movements in Gaza, through this kind of quarantining, occasionally letting some, resources in and so on, and that they would be contained, and had spent its effort more in expanding settlements in the West Bank that was causing, resistance and difficulty. So more of the Israeli attention and forces were there, and also in the intervening period of the last decade, they had managed to negotiate normalization and trade agreements with quite a number of states, like Morocco, like Bahrain, the UAE, and they were looking forward to the big prize of normalization with Saudi Arabia in the so-called Abraham Accords that had been sponsored under the previous presidential administration of Trump, and particularly his envoy for Middle East affairs, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who had close relations with a lot of the Gulf elites and the Gulf monarchies and so on, and was interested, and they've been interested in business and just trying to sideline the pesky Palestinian question. And so what October 7th, 2023 actually did was to reposition Palestine at the center of the political questions of the Middle East and of the region as a whole. And I guess what I'm sort of surprised by is that it was a cause and a basis for really re-articulating kind of unity across different groups and factions, from protests and people gaining an anti-imperialist lens on and a settler, an analysis of Israel as a settler colonial state, was really positive in introducing a new cycle of Palestinian solidarity and broad unity across the left, across the Middle East. And I believe, unfortunately, obviously, it hasn't been significant and strong enough to derail the genocide that's taking place and continuing. But it was marshaling, it seems to me, global resistance in various ways. And I'm a little concerned that in the last month or so, and with the current events that have taken place in Syria, that the kind of dynamic of increasing the isolation, marginalization, and resistance to Israel's project of settler colonial expansion throughout the region was being pushed back, and that while it was much slower than it needed to be, and the Palestinians were suffering the brunt of this genocide, it was starting to have some kind of effect. And that unity, it seems to me, is being fractured a little bit. I mean, I think there's still sentimentally, people are still expressing their solidarity with Palestine, but we haven't really been talking about it so much in the last couple of weeks. And it's even the invasion of Lebanon in some ways started to put pressure on that, because you could see that, for example, with the assassination of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, there were groups that were celebrating this because of this sectarian orientation, and when it was just Gaza, and really you didn't hear so much about Hezbollah and resistance in the north, and it wasn't the major front and theater of Israeli invasion, there was this kind of semblance of unity. And I guess I thought that what was being built were stronger bonds of solidarity that could become politically salient in the long-term future of realigning the politics of the region. Of course, none of the other neighboring countries have done anything, apart from the axis of resistance, but their populations were so pro-Palestine, and that I felt that there was inexorable momentum and solidarity towards reshaping the political future of the region as a whole. And that's something that I did want to mention and talk about with you, is that there is a big problem, it seems to me, with nationalism that has actually bedeviled the entire region. It's been an utter disaster. The nationalism and the structure of the nation state was not natural or organic or, developed in a kind of genuine historical way in the region. It was something that was imposed in the aftermath of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the period of colonial control under the British and French mandates. And this has been an utter disaster, the creation of these new post-colonial nation states that didn't have an organic and coherent sort of basis in history. Because this is a cosmopolitan region, of many different peoples, of different languages and ethnicities and of religions, the nation state as a form of political organization is not necessarily going to be a successful one. In this region, and so one problem that I think this whole region has been suffering in is this ideology of nationalism, and you can see that one of the attractions, perhaps in a way, of these jihadist Takfiri groups is that in one respect, they do address themselves to the failings of the political realities of modern history of the region in the post-colonial era, which is the falsity and the artificiality of these national borders and boundaries, and the way in which certain kinds of interests of predatory, corporate or military or land-owning elite protect themselves by dominating a particular political entity to the detriment of, the people as a whole and of the region. And this is a region that should normally be integrated together and have all kinds of connections of trade and of interconnectivity. That's how it historically functioned before the emergence of these nation states. That has been disrupted, of course, and that's part of my analysis for why it's so important to have an anti-imperial and anti-colonial analysis. Why Israel is such a keystone, a linchpin for preventing the sovereign, integrated development of the region as a whole. But these jihadi takfiris don't recognize these nation states as legitimate, and they're tapping into something there that is genuine, of a supranational or a non-national form of affiliation and identity. Of course, the way they imagine and understand it and the ideology behind it is of a extremely conservative, right-wing oppressive, narrow vision of Islam and Muslim identity. But they are tapping into something, it seems to me, that is being lost if we only think and imagine, politically speaking, the futures as one of nation states and separate and competing national interests. I mean, I think that's what we're living with and dealing with. And I think Syria, for example, the future of Syria is one that is going to be contested not only by, what happens in all of these factions and groups. Will they form what kind of a possible government, or are they just going to fall out into the kind of internecine squabbling and war amongst one another that actually we saw during the course of the whole decade? Even in Idlib, these groups were fighting with one another very frequently. It's kind of a genius move of a nefariously genius move of the Turkish intelligence to coordinate them to some extent, to finally start directing their violent behavior towards a common purpose of toppling the Syrian regime. But soon enough, I mean, will they fall back into the typical pattern of trying to carve out some particular territory, fighting with one another because they have minor ideological or personal interest differences that they then compete with one another over? That's the internal kind of perspective. And then the larger geopolitical perspective, which is it as Syria as a site of contestation between the Gulf monarchies and their interests and vision of the region, and Turkey's, kind of neo-Ottomanist hegemonic kind of ideas pursuing their interests. Will there be some condominium? Will they come to some kind of arrangement over that? Or will they, be competing and sponsoring different groups and factions within Syria to pursue the influence of their sponsors that will just continue to fester into destructive, internecine conflict within Syria? This is an unknown to me. But what it points out is the way in which the nation state system is so detrimental and destructive for the region's health and economic and social and political integration. What's needed is some kind of another sort of non-nation state sort of regional affiliation. We saw that it once was happening under the aegis of Arab nationalism, a project that ended up failing but was so threatening to Western powers, which is why the Eisenhower Doctrine came into effect, which was to regard any militant third world nationalist movement as tantamount to communism and therefore an enemy of the United States, and it had to be suppressed and destroyed. Any kind of regional project has had to be disrupted in order for empire to control this region and its resources. And in particular, it has used the Zionist entity as the frontline state in that plan of fragmentation and disruption. So the question is going forward, will there be some kind of vision that can get some sort of regional program that started to happen? It started to happen when we saw China brokering normalization of diplomatic relationships and a cautious, tentative, but growing peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, to the extent that they're collaborating. I think this week or next week is kind of exercise, joint military exercises, naval exercises in the Red Sea, for example. There were positive developments starting to take place. The membership in BRICS of a number of countries, the interest in joining BRICS by others who had not been part of that earlier round, which included Turkey. But I see what has happened now is Turkey has proven itself a very unreliable partner in any kind of regional or, regional condominium of power and interests outside of the imperial dynamics. As a NATO member, willing to cooperate and collaborate here with breaking the backbone of the axis of resistance, this has put back a possible regional consensus and a way of organizing the region to the mutual benefit of the major players on behalf of sovereign and independent development. that I saw as starting to be a possible trajectory. So it's going to be a very fateful and interesting period going forward.
No, definitely. I think there's a couple of things to that. When it comes to Erdogan, historically, Turkey was known as being secular. I think he kind of brought back this like a, mosque and state kind of
Mm-hmm.
union again, which Turkey wasn't known for, at least since Ataturk, from my understanding. And then
Yes.
on top of that, I remember after October 7th, Erdogan was one of the most vocal when it came to like anti-Israeli sentiments. Yet he was also one of the ones that was supplying weapons, which I thought was really ironic. So when he basically came out and supported this entire regime change in Syria, I don't think anyone was surprised. If anything, I was kind of proud of him. Like I was like, all right, now you're finally showing us who you are. Whereas
Mm.
before you're kind of doing it behind everyone's back. I think the other thing that Turkey had invested in this is the fact that they do have those very anti-Kurdish like sentiments. So I think this
Yes.
was also a big part of that. And then I think in terms of what you were talking about with nation states, I actually think it's more complex than that. Because when you look at this region as a whole, people don't just look at it as like these nation states that came about with a lot of empire help, right? Like, so for
Mm-hmm.
example, in the 1960s, you had the rise of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein through the US, right? And that was the very regime that the US much later on overthrew because it no longer served, American foreign policy interests. But that being said, I think there's a lot of conquer and divide ideologies kind of going on as a byproduct of empire. So you have like Shia versus Sunni, you
Yeah.
have, Christians versus Muslims versus Jews. Then you have basically like Arabs versus Kurds versus Turks versus, Iranians. So I think all of these, I don't want to say weaknesses, but all these different factions within this region is something the empire plays upon. And I
Yes.
think they unfortunately fall into it like a trap. I think if they
Agreed.
had some sort of unification, just like we had during the Ottoman Empire, I
Mm-hmm.
think there would be a form of not just, the axis of resistance with groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, but I think it would be collective with the governments and the population. Because right now we're seeing the populations, independently of their governments are conceptualizing, hey, we need to be anti-imperialist to rise. But the problem is governments are working with each other, behind
Mm-hmm.
each other's backs, and also at the end of the day supporting empire. And that's exactly what empire wants. And I think the biggest lesson that these, nation states need to realize is whether you fight against empire or you support empire, empire will ultimately not have your back. And that's the very
Mm-hmm.
diplomatic way of saying it. But thank you so much for, being on. I really appreciated this conversation. I actually learned a tremendous amount. Just wanted to ask you if you wanted to, put out any of your like handles, ways to contact you, anything of that sort. So, people who want to reach out to you or if they have any questions, they certainly can do so.
Sure. And I just want to thank you again so much for this kind invitation to join you in conversation. And I think you made some very astute points there in your final remarks that remind me that even if, like, you're talking about the broader vision, of a ummah or something like that, that these Islamist kind of groups in Syria might have, is that they looked at it through a very sectarian frame, which is just another way of being able to manipulate and divide, as you said, on behalf of empire. So I really appreciate that final remark. But if people want to, follow me, they can find me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, Husain. You can check out my other couple of podcasts. I'm co-host of Guerrilla History podcast, and also, I have another podcast called The Majlis, Majlis, that has been a little too infrequent, but I'm planning some new things and launching the podcast no longer as part of the kind of university sponsored program that I've been involved with, but just on its own channel. And hopefully that'll give me a lot more latitude in topics and things that I can do. So I'm looking forward to doing some new things, and that'll be a YouTube channel and as a podcast. You can find out more about any of these things. My website, which needs a big update, but soon it'll be updated with all these things at adnanhussein.org. Thanks so much again for inviting me to be on the Muslim Street.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing that. This is Hina Lotus from the Muslim Street. Thank you so much for joining us.